Please welcome our guest of honor, Ms. Yeo Chi Yen, Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth. Our guest of honor, Ms. Yeo Chi Yen, Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth. Mrs. Rosa Daniel, Deputy Secretary Culture for the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, and Chief Executive Officer of the National Heritage Board. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the official launch of the Culture Academy Singapore, and it is its inaugural Distinguished Speaker Lecture by Dr. Neil MacGregor, Director of the British Museum. I'm Grace, your MC for this afternoon. To begin, I would like to invite Mrs. Rosa Daniel, Deputy Secretary Culture for the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, and Chief Executive Officer for the National Heritage Board, to say a few words. Mrs. Daniel, please.
Ms. Yeo Chi Yen, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for coming to the official launch of the Ministry's Culture Academy, and in conjunction with this, an inaugural session under its Distinguished Speaker Series. We are truly among colleagues, friends, partners, and supporters of the arts and heritage in Singapore. The Culture Academy has its roots in the NHB Academy, which was set up in 2010. With this foundation, and after 5 years, it is now repositioned to serve the ministry in reaching out to the wider culture sector. The Academy has 3 parallel tracks that it will focus on. Firstly, it will focus on capability development for the professionals and administrators in the culture sector. Secondly, it will focus on thought leadership through sharing of expertise amongst cultural leaders within and outside Singapore. And thirdly, it seeks to promote, through research and scholarship, a deeper understanding of Singapore and Southeast Asian arts and culture. In a nutshell, the Academy has very ambitious plans to support Singapore's arts and culture professionals in reaching new levels of excellence and to stand tall among their international counterparts. But we cannot do all this without forming strategic partnerships with our cultural and tertiary institutions locally and internationally. We can only flourish with the active participation of institutions within the arts and culture sectors coming together to be trained and to be willing to upgrade our knowledge and skills. The Culture Academy will support in forming partnerships and networks to share ideas and best practices. We will work with and serve our partners in MCCY, such as the National Arts Council, the Esplanade, and the Visual Arts Cluster, which comprises the National Gallery, Singapore Art Museum, and the Singapore Tyler Print Institute. We also have, of course, our partners like LaSalle, NAFA, and we also have our school, SOTA, and we seek to serve everyone among this network of partners in the culture sector. We will also reach out to the network of friends in the museum roundtable of more than 50 museums and galleries, some of whom are here today. In understanding your needs and working with you, we can put together training courses for our cultural leaders and professionals to think out of the box and to be innovative in running their respective institutions. While we put the training of our own professionals in Singapore first and foremost, there will be more opportunities in doing so to also share our experiences with counterparts in the region and beyond. This will contribute to Singapore's reputation as a cultural city of excellence. To mark the launch of the Academy, We are very pleased that we have such a fitting and prominent speaker in Dr. Neil MacGregor, who is a luminary in the international arts and culture scene. The Dean of the Culture Academy, Dr. Alan Chong, will shortly introduce him, and I know, like many of you, we are all eagerly waiting for his lecture that will come shortly, and we are expecting to hear really thought-provoking things from Neil. So it leaves me to thank all of you for coming today, and to especially thank our guest of honor, Ms. Yeo Chee Yen, for launching the Academy. I hope all of you will find this program today stimulating, and that you will continue to participate and contribute to the Academy's objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Daniel. I would now like to invite our guest of honor, Ms. Yeo Chee Yen, Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, to address us. Ms. Yeo, please.
Your Excellencies, our distinguished guest, Dr. Neil MacGregor, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. A warm welcome to the launch of the Culture Academy. All of us here are, in some way, personally invested in Singapore's cultural scene, and I think you would agree that these are exciting times for our arts and heritage institutions. We are now counting down the weeks before the opening of our new National Gallery, which will bring Singapore and Southeast Asian art to the world. We hope that it will be a source of inspiration to Singaporeans, reflecting our multicultural soul and our place at the crossroads of this fascinating region. We continue to transform our pinnacle institutions. We recently revamped the Singapore History Galleries of the National Museum of Singapore, and next month we will launch or relaunch the Asian Civilizations Museum with a new wing and a beautiful new entrance from the Singapore River. With the refurbished Victoria Theatre and Concert Hall, the Arts House, and the Esplanade Forecourt, there are exciting new possibilities for programming which would add vibrancy to the civic district. There is a myriad of festivals, exhibitions, and performances for us to choose from. The 8th edition of the recently concluded Night Festival delighted some 600,000 Singaporeans. And I was very proud to see that the 2nd edition of the Singapore International Festival of Arts this year had a number of excellent new Singapore commissions. The 18th edition of the Singapore Writers' Festival opens later this month to an ever-growing audience. And come December, our Prime Minister will launch the Jubilee Walk, a trail which connects many of our beloved arts and heritage monuments. Our national institutions make a strong contribution to Singapore's vibrant cultural calendar because we continue to invest in the building blocks of infrastructure and quality programming. But we should not forget that it is really the people behind our institutions which make them strong. Our boards are invaluable in providing vision and strategic direction. But critical to the success of our arts and heritage institutions are a group of very special people, namely our cultural policy officers, arts administrators, and museum professionals. MCCY believes that we must invest more in their professional development because at the end of the day, it is their capacity which ultimately determines the extent to which we can build up our institutions, captivate audiences, and be effective facilitators of the wider arts and heritage scene in Singapore. I think we're already doing a fairly good job in professional development. Let me cite 2 examples. The first is Mr. Khairuddin Hori, a former curator of the Singapore Art Museum and NHB, who has joined the Palais de Tokyo, one of the foremost centers of contemporary art in Europe. The second is Mr. Tan Boon Hui, former director of SAM and currently ACE of NHB, who will soon take the helm of the Asia Society Museum in New York, having been chosen for the post from over 100 other candidates. Their success illustrates that we have groomed top talents here in our institutions and that they have valuable perspectives and capabilities to offer both to Singapore and to the world. Both Bun Hui and Khairuddin are especially talented individuals, no doubt. But they also acquired their knowledge and skills through the rich learning experiences and informal mentorships available to them at NHB. I look forward to their return at some point, as their experience at networks will be valuable to our ecosystem. But beyond this informal transmission of tacit knowledge, skills, and networks, there is much more that we can do systematically to nurture the next generation of leaders in our cultural institutions. And this is why we are setting up the Culture Academy. Luckily, as Rosa said, we are not starting from scratch. We are building on the excellent foundations laid by the NHB Academy, which was set up in 2010 as a center of excellence in museum training, scholarship, and research. Some of you will remember that the Academy was the brainchild of Professor Tommy Koh, who was chairman of NHB at that time. It has done good work over the years in training and providing networking opportunities for our museum professionals. But with the growth of new institutions outside NHB, including the National Gallery, SAM, the NAC, its companies, and over 50 private and public museums, we need to expand its mandate. The NHB Academy has thus been entrusted to transform and take on this expanded role. As the refreshed Culture Academy, it will be tasked to groom leaders and develop strong administrators and museum professionals across both the arts and heritage sectors. It will develop competency frameworks and draw on the expertise of local tertiary institutions, as well as international partners like the Smithsonian, the Australian National University, the Rijnvaart Academy in Amsterdam, to offer joint courses on skills and capability development. We aim first and foremost to meet the needs of our own culture professionals so that they'll be well positioned to bring our institutions to international levels of excellence. For instance, we want to train more officers in preservation, conservation, collections planning and development, exhibition design, and digital engagement. I would also like to see us facilitate an active program of interagency secondments or attachments and professional exchanges, both in Singapore as well as with partner institutions abroad. The Academy will also be a platform for research and thought leadership with a focus on Southeast Asian history, art, and culture. Here, the relationships we build with key institutions and partners around the world will be tremendously important to stimulate the exchange of ideas. And that is why we are really very privileged that Dr. Neil MacGregor is here today as the inaugural speaker of the New Culture Academy's Distinguished Speaker Series. In closing, may I say that the Culture Academy is designed to build capability and capacity across MCCY, the MCCY family of cultural agencies and institutions. We hope to grow a culture of deep expertise and a habit of collaboration and international exchange. And we hope that the Academy will help make Singapore a place where cultural leaders meet, exchange ideas, and in so doing, grow a deeper understanding of our own culture and that of Southeast Asia. I wish the Culture Academy every success. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yeo. May I request that Ms. Yeo remain on stage to officiate the launch. I would also like to invite Mrs. Rosa Daniel, as well as Dr. Alan Chong, Dean of the Culture Academy and Director of the Asian Civilization Museum, to join Ms. Yeo on stage. Right, Ms. Yeo, Mrs. Daniel, and Dr. Chong, on my count, please place your right hands onto the eyeball. Are you ready? Yes. Audience, you may like to join me as well. 3, 2, 1. Round of applause, please. Congratulations. The Culture Academy Singapore is now officially launched. Thank you, Ms. Yeo, Mrs. Daniel, and Dr. Chong. Ladies and gentlemen, in conjunction with the official launch of the Culture Academy, we are very privileged today to have Dr. Neil MacGregor, Director of the British Museum, with us today. And he will be sharing his thoughts on a shared history for a global world. But before that, I would now like to invite Dr. Alan Chong, Dean of the Culture Academy and Director of the Asian Civilization Museum, to introduce Dr. MacGregor. Dr. Chong, please. Thank you.
Honored guests, welcome to the first event of the Cultural Academy. The purpose, as we set out the Academy in our brainstorming sessions, was both to provide practical training and networking opportunities, but also to provide imagination and inspiration for big thinking that might change the way we conceive of our institutions here in Singapore. I can think of no better speaker than Neil MacGregor, who has helmed some of the major institutions in Britain, to share his thoughts about transforming institutions and the role they play, not only in their country, but in the world. Neil has been in great demand at institutions around the world, and the rumor mills abound with stories that he's been offered nearly every major job in our field, from the Louvre directorship to the Berlin museums to the Metropolitan Museum. But he's, in fact, been in charge of several significant organizations, as you can read in his biography. First of all, as editor of the Burlington Magazine, one of the most important publications in the field of art history, which he transformed and enlivened into a major thoughtful organ of discussion in our field. And then as director of the National Gallery in London, he spearheaded not only new wings, but also important new initiatives that made the gallery relevant really to all audiences. And he embraced curators that came from many different backgrounds and forms of training, and I think has really enlivened that institution and set it on its current path forward. And since 2002, as director of the British Museum, he's performed a similar transformative role in revitalizing a museum that was facing a number of crises, financial, infrastructural, and as well as staff. And I'll just highlight a few of his key contributions. He created this show on the Hajj, on the pilgrimage journey that millions of Muslims from all over the world take. And it proved an enormously resonant project that tapped in not only to historical practice and religious thought, but also to contemporary art and modern ideas. And it is a show that numerous other institutions have borrowed from and actually presented versions of. It's one of the great success stories. It's this embrace of world cultures that's particularly important, I think, and we'll hear more about this, I'm sure, in a few seconds. A curiosity of the whole world, that we are responsible not only to our trustees, our governance, our immediate audiences, and our national context, but we as museum practitioners and as leaders of cultural institutions are really responsible to the entire world, not only for the safekeeping of our collections, but also for innovative thought, an approach that embodies curiosity for the entire world. And various British Museum initiatives that involve training young professionals from all over the world, embracing cross-cultural initiatives such as the Indian Ocean as an important place of exchange. These are the things that really Neil has brought to the mission of the British Museum and that we look to with great interest and respect. So it's great personal pleasure to welcome Neil MacGregor to inaugurate the Cultural Academy of Singapore with this, with his lecture. Neil.
Thank you, Alan, for those very kind words. And may I start by thanking the National Heritage Board for inviting me here today and doing me the great honour of asking me to be present at the opening, the launch of the Culture Academy. I'm already filled with envy at that mechanical eyeball that's over there. Yes, we have nothing like that in Britain at all. And I think we'll try to open all our future exhibitions by asking people to touch on the count of 3. It was a magnificent beginning, and thank you for allowing me to watch that. I thought what would be one of the things I wanted, what might be interesting to talk about today, are some of the things that link London and Singapore, and in particular at this moment when in Singapore an enormous investment, an enormous amount of energy is being placed on the remaking of the cultural institutions. It's a very exciting moment for the rest of the world to be in Singapore as the new National Museum, the new National Gallery, a whole set of renewed institutions consider what the past means in the present and how that past should be thought about, debated, made available so that we can understand ourselves. And I think that past has a very particular role in global cities. This is the cover of The Economist fairly recently, talking about the 4 major global cities as they saw it, New York, London, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And all global cities, of course, share a few characteristics. They always have connections with the whole world, they have populations from the whole world, and what I want to argue is that they have stories, a history, that can't be told without the rest of the world. They share their history, and it's that idea of shared histories for our kinds of cities that I want to look at for a moment. All global cities know that they are, of course, the middle of the world. One of the things I love about all airline maps is that it's perfectly clear where the centre of the universe is. And this is not a joke at the expense of Singapore. The British Airways one does exactly the same thing. We know that we are in the middle. But we also know that we are part of something much, much bigger. And that is, of course, the distinguishing characteristic. And I want to think about what it means to be a global city. And to start by arguing that the story begins, the first global city is London, 260, 280 years ago. London in the early 18th century is a global city in a way that no city had ever been able to be before. The huge changes in technology and shipping of the 17th century in Europe, and above all, the mastery of longitude and being able to know where you were sailing to and from, meant that it was possible in the early years of the 18th century, for the first time in history, to sail to any point in the world and to be sure you could get back. There had, of course, always been great regional cities from which ships traded over the ocean, the Indian Ocean, the China Sea, the Mediterranean. But by the early 18th century, something quite new was possible. And why did it happen in London? It's not just because the technology was there, because it was an old trading city, but to be a global city in our modern sense, you need not just the capacity to navigate, you need the capital market that will let you put together and support ships. Ships are very risky, huge profits if you get it right when they come home with the cargo, terrible losses if they don't. So you need a banking system, you need something like limited companies, you need insurance companies, and you need some kind of regulatory legal framework. All of these happened in London at the same time. And as you know, the result was that by the 1720s, 1730s, London is by far the largest city in Europe. It's by far the most connected, the most cosmopolitan. And it's become a commonplace by the middle of the century that you can draw into your daily life things from all over the globe. And the perfect example of that in the collection of the British Museum is Lord Anson's dinner plate. Lord Anson, the Admiral, circumnavigates the world in the early 1750s. And he writes a book about it, and having made a great deal of money in the process, as admirals tended to do in Britain in the 18th century, he decides he needs a new dinner service, which of course he commissions in China and has prepared for home in England. And on the middle of the dinner plate, he puts not only at the top and bottom his coat of arms, but in the middle, scenes from his journeys. This is the breadfruit tree in the Pacific, which he found particularly interesting. And then he got the Chinese painter to paint the two harbours that were most important to him in the world. On the one side, Canton, Guangdong. On the other side, Plymouth. The Chinese artist had, of course, never seen Plymouth. So to the untrained eye, it's quite difficult to distinguish which is Canton and which is Plymouth. But Lord Anson certainly knew. And it does mean that every day he was able to dine with the world around him, with scenes from all over the world in front of him, and food brought around. It is, I think, the first moment of the global economy. And the global economy produced not just enormous wealth, great increase in trade all around the globe, but a whole set of intellectual consequences. If you could trade with the whole world, you could bring things back from the whole world. That means, for the first time, you could compare what the whole world made. And this is an enormous development. On the economic side, Adam Smith is looking at this sort of world of the Port of London, trading with other countries, in this case particularly with France. And Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations, looking at the intellectual, the political consequences and the economic consequences of that kind of trade. But if you bring things back and compare them, you can do something else. And the philosophers, the intellectuals of London, begin to ask ship's captains to bring back not just goods that can be sold, but goods they can collect, study, and compare. How does every country manage the question of medicine? What do people use as medicines? And you can then look and compare. How do they manage the way they look after their children? How do they manage their gods? And if you collect their gods, if you collect their weapons, if you collect their money, you begin to see that there are many different ways of organizing societies, and you can achieve the great dream of 18th century Europe. You can establish that all humanity is effectively the same. This is the great need. Europe in the 1750s, everybody remembered that in the previous 200 years, millions of people in Europe had been killed in wars of religion, wars about how countries should be governed. And the only way people could see out of this was to compare with the rest of the world and see that there are many answers to any one question. That's where the idea of a global museum, a world collection, begins. And it's the origin of the British Museum, which is, I think one can argue, one of the first intellectual consequences of a global economy. Our collection begins with a very wealthy doctor, Hans Sloane, a very clever, ambitious man, who, like many clever, ambitious doctors, decides that he'll choose patients who are not terrifically ill, but are enormously rich. And on the strength of this, was able to put together what was, at the time of his death, the largest collection in Europe, not in the hands of a duke or a prince, of comparative material from the whole world. It had a library with it, a huge library, and it had also natural history. And Sloane is very eager that anybody could study this. Anyone can write to him, go and look at that, visit the house, use the collection to study and to write. You just need to apply. But he's very concerned because he has only 2 daughters. And in 18th century Britain, if you want to run a serious scientific institution, 2 daughters are not really a great encouragement. What you want them to do, of course, is to get married. So he decides he'll have to sell the collection in order to make sure that his daughters can marry at the level he would wish. He offers the collection, and this is, I think, a very significant point for our collection and I think for all global collections. First of all, to the Parliament of Great Britain, But if they don't want it, it's to be offered to St. Petersburg, then to Berlin, then to Paris, and then to Madrid. Always on the same conditions, that it must be open, free, and it must be kept together. He doesn't care where it is, provided as many people as possible can use it and see it. Parliament bought it. The daughters married very nicely, and Sir Hans Sloane's daughter married Lord Cadogan, which is why those of you who know London will not be surprised to know that Sloane Square, Cadogan Square, and Hans Street are all together, the result of his collecting. Parliament had done something it had never done before. Like most British governments, it was terrified at the idea of culture. I'm sorry, High Commissioner, it does have to be said. And even more terrified at the idea of spending money on culture. And here it had bought a collection. And it had bought a collection for study. So what was it to do? The key point about this study was that it must not be controlled. You must be able to come to conclusions that were not welcome to the established church, to the established government. So you couldn't have it run by the state, by the king, by the ministers. So they invented the idea of a trustee museum. It's the first trustee museum in the world. And they decided they've got to find somewhere to put it. It can't just be in the palace. So they look around London and they stumble on this house. It belonged to the Duke of Montagu, but like any proper duke, he had quite a number of houses, and this one was spare. And so they buy Montagu House, and they move the collection in. It's to be kept together forever, it's to be extended, and it's to be freely available to anybody. The wording of the Parliamentary Act is remarkable. This is 1753. And this collection, which it says is to be aimed at universality, that's the idea, the whole world is to be under this roof. It has to be free, it says, to all studious and curious persons, native and foreign. So the trustees have to hold this collection for the whole world, not just for the British, which makes it even odder that it was called the British Museum. It's the first public institution to be called British. And as you all know, if you visited it, there's very little about British history in it. Why it's called British is because this was to be the museum for the citizen. This was to be the British citizen's collection. This was what would make the British citizen a citizen not just of Britain, but of the world. And if you wanted to see it, you just applied and you got a ticket. And as you see, in the 18th century, open to everybody meant open to everybody who was interested in these kind of things. You had to apply, and you were allowed to see it. And as you see, it was to be completely free, and in the 18th century, that meant no money to be given to the servants. What had happened was, and when you turned up at 1 o'clock on Wednesday, the 3rd of March, the door was opened to you by Mary Bygrove, the housekeeper. And she took you in and she let you loose. What had been done was something completely extraordinary. This is completely different from the great collections of the Louvre or the Hermitage. This is not a royal collection which has graciously been made open to you if the king allows it. This is your collection. It's the private collection of every citizen. And every citizen can use it as they choose. There was nothing like this in Europe at all. And it was, in intellectual terms, a revolution. It was a kind of open university. There was no university in London, astonishingly. London, the biggest city in Europe, the richest city in Europe, and the only one of its scale without university. Because, as always, in Parliament, Oxford and Cambridge were so strongly represented, they blocked every attempt to have another university. That went on until 1830. So this is the Open University for the people of London trading with the world. And it is about understanding the world. What is important about this collection is that what Mary Bygrove lets you in, she was taken on by the trustees at the age of 11, and died at nearly 80. All of us in the museum regard her as our sort of grandmother, and rather hope we don't have to serve so long. But what she let you into was not an art museum. It was a museum that was about societies. How do people live together? How do they work? And what do they make that let you understand how they think? And that idea of a private citizen visiting their own collection remained when, on the same site, the new building was put up in the 1820s, the building you all know. And I don't know what Mary Bygrove now would make of the fact that 7 million people a year come to the British Museum, and that her front garden on a busy summer's day is invaded in this way. But it's this idea of a place where you can look at the world together and compare it, and out of that deduce that we are all essentially one, that there is such a thing as shared humanity, that the British Museum is about. And it's why it was so important for a global city in the 18th century, and it's why I think it's still important as a collection for a global city now. And it's why we're particularly pleased that in early December, a selection from the BM's collections will be coming to the National Museum here. And it will be here for over 5 months. What I want to do is now just look at some of the things that will be coming and talk about why they were collected and what they were meant to suggest as ideas to pursue, to reflect on, and to consider. But of course, because it's coming to Singapore, one of the objects that we wanted to put in, one of the great attempts to understand the world, is some material from the collection of Stamford Raffles. Raffles, this of course is his drawing of Borobudur in Java. And Raffles is a very interesting example of the way in which the collection grew. It was very often, I say, by people like Sir, collected in London by ship captains. It was often also collected by people from the East India Company or trading elsewhere. And Raffles, as you know, built a collection in order to demonstrate to Europeans that the civilization of Java was the equivalent of that of Greece and Rome. A very startling proposal in Europe of the 1810s, 1820s, and one that he defended with great verve and vigor. But the collection starts, of course, much earlier. The collection begins at the very beginning of what human beings make and what human beings are. And the first object chronologically in the exhibition starts when humanity starts, about 1.5 million years ago. And it's the object without which you can't have any global cities. It's the object without which none of us would be here. It is the Handaxe. This, I think you can safely say, this ability to chip bits of stone into a tool that lets you scrape the meat off the bones of large animals, then strip the hides to make clothes, then strip the trees to make huts. This is the technology. It's the only technology that has ever mattered in the history of the world. 99% of human history was shaped by this object. It's this object that lets us leave Africa somewhere around 1.5 million years ago and spread across the world. This is why humans are the only species to be found in every climate, in every place. This lets us control our environment, as we've always dreamed of doing and still do. But this one, this particular one, which is coming to Singapore, tells you something else. The earliest ones found in the Rift Valley in Kenya and Tanzania are about 1.5 million years old. Simple, edged bits of stone to let you break the bones of the animals, get to the marrow, that lets you have the protein, which will let your brain grow, which will let you do even more things. This is 1.2 million years. In those 300,000 years, something extraordinary had happened. Because this is, of course, as you can see, a beautifully shaped, symmetrical Handaxe. It fits beautifully in your hand. It's much more beautifully finished than it needs to be to do the job that is required. Somebody's taken a lot of trouble to make it shaped and symmetrical. And even more interesting, and I hope you'll see it even more clearly in the exhibition, is that it's a very, very pretty, sparkly, glitzy, pink stone. This makes it much, much harder to carve and to chip and to shape. Much, much harder. There's no benefit at all in what you can cut with it. And we know, because of where it was found, that the stone must have been sought and brought over hundreds of miles to be used where it was eventually found and deposited in the Rift Valley. So from at least 1.2 million years ago, we are making things that are beautiful as well as useful. We make them complicated because we enjoy solving the problems of complication. And we like things that sparkle and things that come from far away. This is the 1.2 million years ago equivalent of the Rolex watch or whatever. It's far, far more complicated than you need to tell the time, but it does tell all your neighbors something much more important than the time. And this is one of the this is the way in which this collection tells us about ourselves. This does, of course, say everything about those very, very early Stone Age moments of human experience. But it also tells you something very profound about ourselves. We love making things beautiful, difficult. We love going beyond the functional. And in the exhibition, we've deliberately chosen a number of objects which are completely everyday objects, but which are not. Fish hooks. In Central Africa, in the plains, what you need for your protein is, of course, big animals. So you need the chopping tools. If you live near the sea, it's protein, it's fish. And here, as you see from the Cook Islands, this enormous fish hook. Extraordinarily difficult to make, carve out of wood like this, and it is about this high. Now, this is a fish hook that nobody could ever use. And that we find very early on. We make these things that are beyond use, but are meant to impress, or are they meant for the gods? Why? But it's a pattern all the way through. If this is what we can do with the fish hook, then a very simple hunting knife in West Africa can turn into this. Absolutely hopeless as a hunting knife now, but very, very beautiful. And the sort of thing that, when they were collected in the early 20th century, inspired Picasso and Matisse in their reshaping of the human form. We move very quickly and everywhere from the functional to the beautiful. It's not about setting one need first and then the other. And whether it's war or hunting, we're playing at the same time. And the simple sticks, as you can see here, in Papua New Guinea, a simple stick turns into a dance baton, turned miraculously into a sort of human shape, again of the sort that any early 20th century artist would have found fascinating. And even when it comes to the simplest kind of human act, killing each other, where all you want is a straightforward blade, we can't, of course. We have to make a kris. And we have to make an extremely elaborate, wobbly kind of blade, which will show all other kinds of things, as well as the fact that we want to kill each other. And it is, of course, very familiar to all of you. What does this tell us? It tells us that these objects are about us as well as about them, about here as well as about there. And in the exhibition, we tried to show some of the themes that everybody has to address. And one of the richest societies, of course, for showing that is the world of ancient Egypt. As the whole thing of a global world is about communication, then there are a number of boats in the exhibition. This is the magnificent little model of a boat which was buried in the tomb of a rich Egyptian somewhere around 4,000 years ago. And it's part of that need we find very early on to prepare for the life after death, what will happen. And one, of course, of the great worries of the rich Egyptians, as the worries of the rich everywhere, is how we manage without the staff. And in early society, you simply kill the staff at the same time so that they're with you for the afterlife. That is quite quickly thought to be extravagant. And so a simpler solution is you make tiny models of the staff and the boats, and by the powers of magic, these will revive when you revive. So you can embark on your new life. You are properly prepared in your mummy, this beautiful portrait of an adolescent boy, wrapped up, prepared, so that his body and his spirit are ready for the great journey of the afterlife. And the servants will be there to do whatever is required, just as they are in life. The afterlife will be like this one, but better organized. A constant view of humanity. And for the Egyptians, that supremely managed and regulated society, one of the things that they were very concerned about in the afterlife was how would the organization and the bureaucracy run. It was a supremely civil service focused society, like all great empires. And it's quite clear that as you proceed through the afterlife, there's going to be an awful lot of bureaucracy to address. There are going to be forms to fill in, there are going to be questions at every barrier. And so you can't set off without a guide. So the Book of the Dead, which is coming, and you can't see this very clearly, but this is what you have buried with you, which is to tell you in the hieroglyphics, this tells you what the questions are going to be when you get to particular thresholds. These are the scenes of judgment. Here is the judge sitting in court. You are standing in front of him, and they tell you what questions he's going to ask, and like all proper civil servants, he'll do exactly what he knows has to be done, and you will have the proper answers. And he'll ask you, of course, all the usual questions that the dead get answered by judgment. Usually, what have you done wrong? And this is the terrible problem for the Egyptians because, of course, the heart, which has been carefully preserved in the mummified body, taken out and preserved so that it will be intact for the future, the heart has this terrible habit of speaking the truth. So you have to put something on the heart, ideally a great scarab beetle, to stop it telling the truth. And these magnificently made beetles of lapis lazuli surrounded by gold, placed on the heart so that it will not be able to give evidence. And I think it's fortunate that we're sitting in a transformed law court where this process must have been gone through many times. And it does, and of course, all of this resonates exactly, doesn't it? We all know exactly what is going on. We know these are people exactly like us. And we know that for the last 50,000 years, we're dealing with people with brains exactly like ours, a capacity to imagine, to order, to think exactly like ours. And we can be very close, I think, to these people. And even this, of course, has to be magnificently beautiful, although its prime function is to make sure the gods don't find out what we've been up to. It's one of the great glories of the museum, of course, our collection of Egyptian material, to such an extent that this famous cartoon in Punch, the jackal judge Anubis questioning the mummy, and the answer being, there must be more to the afterlife than hanging around the British Museum. The terrible disappointment for the mummies of Egypt to find they've wound up in Bloomsbury. But there is the consolation that now some of them are coming to Singapore, so we're doing our bit to cheer them up. As I said, there are boats all through. Boats, every society makes boats as soon as it possibly can for trading, for fishing, this magnificent little kayak from the Canadian Arctic. And of course, you make them as models for your children so they will know what's coming. And you travel with the boats, and all this part of the world is, of course, a world shaped by sea travel, people moving around, things moving around, ideas moving around. And we wanted to illustrate through some very beautiful objects that whenever people travel, they don't just take goods in order to trade. They also take, of course, their ideas and above all their stories. And we saw in Borobudur the way Raffles studied Borobudur, he was fascinated by the fact that it was quite clear that the sculpture in Borobudur showed Indian influence. He realized that the sculptors or the knowledge of an Indian sculptural tradition must have traveled with the people who brought Hinduism to Java. And as well as Hinduism, they brought, of course, the great myths and the great stories. And all across Southeast Asia, figures of Hanuman. People take their myths and their great stories with them. They can't travel without. And whether it's Hanuman in this magnificent little bronze from South India, or the marvelous Rama on the Garuda from Bali, the objects will tell you that people cannot leave their stories behind. And they take the stories with them, and they become the stories of the place they go to. This is, in a very literal sense, a shared story, a shared history. And the more people that come to your city, the more stories you have, the more stories you're able to share. What do we want to, that's one obvious strand, if you like. We all know that emigrants take with them not just the way they cook, but the way they tell their children stories. And the two together are probably what makes a civilization. But that even what are thought to be universal ideas change immediately once in a local context. And so in that 18th century desire to show how religion is a universal need, and everybody needs to have an idea of the divine, we chose deliberately objects that are far from the original source. So the Christian objects, this little St. Joseph made of ivory from the Philippines. But the ivory in the Philippines, well, as you know, there aren't many elephants in the Philippines. What is fascinating is that the ivory is brought from Africa to the Philippines to be made into a Christian imagery, then to be re-exported to South Asia. The Muslim tradition doesn't, of course, have the images of the holy people or of the gods. What they do have, of course, is the writing, the script, the word. And we've chosen this magnificent gravestone to make a very particular point, that it's carved in Gujarat, but it's carved in Gujarat ordered by a merchant in Yemen, as you can tell from the inscription. This is a global religion already at this date, trading and traveling, and faith travels along the trade routes. Nowhere more clearly, of course, than in the case of the Buddha, where we chose this magnificent Gandhara standing Buddha, the perfect demonstration that this Indian faith first finds its expression in human form in a Greek visual language, and until then doesn't, as you know, the early Buddhist images are of the symbols of the feet or the tree. But the first human image is in the Greek visual language, and that language then changes, of course, as it moves into China, as on this silk painting, or changes again as it moves south into Borneo. These are ideas that are very evident in the Museum of Asian Civilizations here. They're an essential part of a shared story. And one of the remarkable things, I think, about this kind of movement is that the idea remains the same, but the form in which the divine can be grasped has to be other, has to respond to what the local population will understand. And beside the religious demonstration of this, we put a secular one about the other great human need, as well as making war and as well as believing. We all like to play games. And the greatest game of all, of course, is the one that comes from India, that organizing of war that we all know as chess. The idea that you can make war into a game, a tidy game with rules and order, is something that once the Indians invent it, everybody understands and wants. We all dream of a world where war can be reduced to chess. The game moves west into the Mediterranean, through the Middle Ages, until by 1200, every sophisticated European wants to play chess, even in Ireland. Now, I speak as a Scot, so it's almost as bad. We are right on the edge of the civilized world, right on the edge, couldn't be further away. But we want to play chess, and we know that if you're in Ireland, you order your chess sets in Norway, because that's where people had their chess sets made in 1200. A proper chess set, as the Indians have shown us, should be made of ivory, of course, but there aren't too many elephants in Norway either. So walrus ivory does it, the tusks. But the key figure of the infantry, if you like, or the cavalry in an Indian game is, of course, the mounted elephant. In Western Europe, that has to be, of course, the knight. He has to become a horseman, and he has to be carved in walrus ivory. And these are made in Trondheim, probably somewhere around 1220. And then they set off for Ireland, which seems to have been the chess-playing capital of Europe at this point. And the ship gets, we don't know what happens, but they're buried, these chess pieces, on the island of Lewis and the Hebrides in northwest Scotland. And they're found in the 1820s. And they're a brilliant example of how the one idea has to be expressed in different languages as well as different materials. It's not just walrus ivory. We have knights on horseback instead of elephants. But a war in medieval Europe is, of course, impossible without the church. You can't have the war without the church. Not only do you need their blessing as for the Crusades, but as they're great landowners, landlords, you need their support. And the Lewis chessmen coming to Singapore include the earliest known bishop in the Western European game. This is the first evidence we have that even at the level of a game, you know that without your bishops, you can't make war. They are magnificent objects. Well worth looking at. They're marvellously characterized close up, and particularly the Queen. I'm not showing you her because I want you to come to the exhibition. But she is, of course, the figure who has now become the great central figure in the game. She's the power. And she looks very tough indeed. The Lewis chessmen are one of the universals that we all want to try to turn war into a game, whether it's sport, which is obviously one way, or whether it's this kind of game, it doesn't really matter. We need order, and we long for order, and we try to impose it on battle, but we also try to impose it, of course, on the natural world. Pattern is something we need. Pattern, because we can predict it, because it suggests we can manage and arrange our lives, and even when the pattern is so successful, as on a Chinese plate, the great blue and white tradition, this magnificently complex shaped pattern in the middle, as it moves on, the next people can never stick with what they've got. Just as the Handaxes have to get bigger and glitzier, just as the fish hooks have to get more and more outsize. You can't stick with a perfectly successful flower pattern. When this pattern moves on to Turkey, it's got to have color, and it's got to be totally symmetrical in a very pleasing way. We long to innovate. And one of the extraordinary things is that we can, of course, make a world that we haven't seen. It's one of the extraordinary moments in human history that somewhere around 40,000 years ago, we begin making and representing objects which cannot exist. We recombine nature, and we love doing it. And one of the runs of objects in the exhibition are objects from the natural world turned into something that nobody would ever have seen, but which would be very nice if nature had got round to. So a fish, entirely made of iron, and a magnificent Japanese fantasy fish, showing really very little else except that the man that made this was extremely clever with iron and was able to imagine a fish doing a handstand for the delight of everybody around. And once you start looking at the fish sequence or the bird sequence, you get, again, this amazing fish sculpture from Papua New Guinea. And as you try to sort out where the head is and the tail and the fin, you realize the fun this person must have had taking that little bit of wood and rearranging in it the different bits of the fish in a way that, had a fish been a wooden ball, this is what a fish would have looked like. And we all enjoy it. They enjoyed making it quite clearly. This playing is something that is completely universal. I think my favorite in the exhibition is this magnificent glass jar from Iran of a bird stretching up to swallow something, but waiting for it to be poured into. And there are a run of birds, just to show you, birds turned into clubs, as you can see here, or into a magnificent brooch to wear on the chest, these frigate birds from the Solomon Islands. And once you get into animals, of course, the scope for humour is absolutely limitless. And this magnificent Cypriot bullfight between a bull and some kind of bird, which is either a bird grooming the bull, which does occasionally happen, or else it's a straightforward joke about an impossible kind of bullfight. This is what we are. We all do this. And every culture, the humour in these objects is a humour we can still respond to. And behind it all is the question always, so who are we? Who do we think we are? How do we show ourselves? And here the range is just as dizzying of the way we can think ourselves to be. Western Europe, indeed most of the world, is now completely fixated on the Greek myth of a lot of time in the gym, regular working out, holding your tummy in, and then strutting around. This tradition of the Olympic Games, of the athlete wearing very little, usually in Greece nothing, but always very little, showing off the beauty of the body, is an extraordinarily powerful one. And it was completely new. No culture until this time had ever shown the naked body other than something shameful. One of the big mysteries of human life, of human history, is why is it that in a world where the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, everybody saw the naked body as something you concealed, the Greeks take a different decision and make the body something beautiful to cultivate and something that we can all immediately recognize, and most of us spend too much time worrying about. And there are other ways of doing it, of course. And again, one of the strands in the exhibition is not to teach about different ways, but simply to leave one to wonder at how a totally other set of people with exactly the same brains and the same eyes as the Greeks can fashion a male figure like this to represent something completely different, seeing something else in the body. What do we see when we look at each other? What do we see inside each other when we look at each other? This is as startling and as alien to us as the cycladic measuring version of the female form reduced to simple planes and the possibility of childbirth. But childbirth in a magnificently controlled geometric environment, which is clearly something different. And all the way through, rearranging the body, the Picasso of his great love, Jacqueline, leaning on her hand, and the Julian Opie of the most beautiful kind of woman in Britain in 2006. I'm afraid that may be true. And the constant is, of course, the constant. And the last thing that we all share after gods and trade and death and love is, of course, sex. And the young men are always more eager to have it than the young women, apparently. And this takes its place in a whole series of global representations of this kind of encounter among the young. And the Japanese, rather encouragingly for people of my generation, show this continuing until well into later life. This tradition of Japanese shunga, spring paintings, was one of the great traditions in Japan until the arrival of the missionaries after the 1850s. It's a tradition which was highly evolved, these erotic, in some cases one would have to say in our terms, pornographic imagery, done apparently entirely to talk about the pleasure and the delight of sex. The American missionaries in the 1860s thought this should be discouraged, and the first exhibition of this material was held a couple of years ago at the British Museum and then in Japan. And this, of course, this later stage of human pleasure can only be got to by going through the horrors of adolescence. And this is one of my favourite images in the British Museum, this extremely nervous young Persian boy who was beginning to wonder whether that hat was such a good idea after all. And we can so imagine him buying it and thinking what a dash he was going to cut. And then, then. This is what the exhibition is about. It's about showing that if you collect the world, you discover that we are all, in a very deep sense, the same, although the same in such wonderfully different ways that is exhilarating and energizing. And that idea of a shared history is particularly important, I think, at the moment, because one object in the exhibition, which was planned before recent developments, is this statue from Palmyra. And since we planned the exhibition, it has, of course, taken on a totally different kind of meaning. We had originally seen it as part of the section about representing the human body and the human form. And this, of course, comes from the city that is now being destroyed, and where I think we've come to understand in a very real way what it means to have a shared history and what it means when someone takes it away from us. And it will be in the exhibition, I think, a rather poignant reminder of the need to acknowledge what it means to be citizens of the world and equal inheritors of every part of humanity's creations. But we want to finish on something a little chirpier. So the latest object in the exhibition is Jim Dine's Beautiful Heart, which is as near as you can come, I think, in any work of art, saying that it's all going to be all right. I think that, and it's a very, very beautiful object. That's what the exhibition is about. And I think it does matter, because global cities and the world we live in is a world, whether we're in Singapore or in London or anywhere in between, where xenophobic nationalism and the division of humanity by race or by religion is becoming ever more frequently part of the political dialogue, part of the political weaponry of those who rule us. And one of the weapons we have against that attempt to divide is, I think, this insistence that we are all part of one humanity, who for as long as one can imagine and as long as history can tell us, all believe about the same kind of thing, think about the same kind of things, and laugh at the same kind of things. And that is what we hope will be the result of the museum's exhibition when it comes to Singapore. Thank you very much.